The snow was falling sideways, not down, hitched to the wind like loose nails in a blender. Mara wrapped a scarf twice around her mouth as she climbed the tenement steps on Rivington, boots chewing slush, shoulder against the weight of the old glass door. Inside, the vestibule smelled like ancient damp and hot copper. Someone had taped cardboard over a cracked pane and written "Please pull gently" in red marker that had bled into the tape. She pulled gently, and the door yelped like a dog. The lobby light flickered a sour lemon color, then stabilized. A radiator hissed and rattled. From the basement came a dull, steady hum, boiler, maybe, or laundry machines that had outlived their warranty and their conscience. Luis, her cousin and the part-time doorman, was supposed to be at the desk, but his chair was empty. The clipboard was there, the pen on a string dangling, and the little transistor radio he kept for Nick's scores was crackling with static. Mara set down the grocery tote, milk, ramen, batteries, cheap wine, and pressed the button for the elevator. It shuddered awake somewhere deep in the shaft and groaned toward her. She watched the indicator, 5, 4, 3, and then it stuttered, coughed, and stuck at 3. She let it go, took the stairs, 2 flights up, heart thrumming from the cold more than the climb. Her hands still smelled faintly of chlorhexidine from the ER, where she'd done 3 12-hour shifts in a row. On the second-floor landing, she stopped to catch her breath and listened to the storm tear at the alley. There was a sound in the walls, the building symphony of winter, steam pinging in pipes, the angry gargle of a distant toilet, and above it all, a low bass note like a bus idling underground. The East Broadway line ran close enough to vibrate the old bones of the place. The floor felt alive under her boots, trembling minutely, like a sleeping dog dreaming of running. She fumbled with her keys at 2B. Theo across the hall cracked his door and peered out, owl-eyed, hair erect. He was a grad student who never seemed to sleep and always smelled faintly of printer toner and instant coffee. "You hear the sirens?" he asked. "Cones all over Delancey. Transformer blue. They're saying rotating outages to keep the grid from tanking." "Of course," she said, shouldering into her apartment. "Perfect night for the city to dim. Also," he leaned into the hall, lowered his voice, "Mrs. Kovacs was knocking earlier. Asked if you'd be home tonight. Said she heard a voice on the intercom. A little boy." Mara paused. "There aren't any kids on too." "That's what she said." Theo's mouth pulled tight. "My money's on a crossed wire. Or she fell asleep with the radio on." "Tell her I'll check in," Mara said, "after I put down my life." The apartment was narrow and obedient, the kind of place that learned your footsteps and echoes. She put the milk in the tiny fridge that rattled like an angry bee, pulled off her boots, and listened to the radiator ticking as steam began to flow. Snow drove against the kitchen window so hard it sounded like sand. She imagined the city beyond, 10 million routines snapped like twigs by a storm that had come screaming up the coast. Her phone vibrated. A text from Luis. "Going to basement. Water on boilers low. If lights flicker, don't panic." She smiled at the if. Then the hall intercom crackled, a tiny burst of static followed by a thin, close voice. "Mara!" She froze. The speaker grill by her door was older than she was, 2 square inches of oxidized metal. She pressed talk. "Yeah." Nothing. Just a hiss. She pressed again. "Luis? That you?" The silence was profound, like the building holding its breath while the storm punched it. Then the voice came back, thin, childlike and breathy, the syllables clipped like a radio with a dying battery. "Hello," it said. "It's so cold." She swallowed. "Who is this?" A click. Then the line went dead. The radiator banged like someone knocking inside the pipe. Mara knocked on Mrs. Kovacs's door, 2D, the one with a crocheted wreath that had faded to a blue that wasn't a color so much as a memory. The old woman opened quickly, grey hair pinned, cardigan buttoned up to her collarbone. Her apartment smelled like boiled potatoes and mothballs, and something faintly medicinal. "You're home," she said, eyes glistening. "Good. I thought perhaps you were at the hospital." "I'm home." Mara nodded toward the wall panel. "You heard someone too?" Mrs. Kovacs pressed a hand to her chest. "A boy. Very polite. He said, please. He sounded, I don't know, close. Like he was in the hall, but far away also. I asked his name and he said, Eli. I never heard of an Eli in this building." Her fingers trembled on the doorframe. "When I asked what apartment, he said, downstairs. But the voice was from upstairs. Is that possible? The wires get all confused. During a storm?" Mara said, "Anything's possible." She tried to smile. Theo said the grid's unstable. From the stairwell came a sudden clatter and a curse. Luis emerged, dusted with plaster, a flashlight clenched in his fist. "Somebody jammed a coat hanger in the basement door latch," he said, wiping his brow. "Dumb kids, I guess. Boiler's coughing like a geriatric smoker. We might lose heat if the water level drops again." He looked at Mara. "You get that text?" "Yeah. You okay?" "I'll live. Cone says brownouts in 30. He lifted the flashlight. "Anybody else hear weird stuff on the intercom?" They had all heard weird stuff on the intercom. On the second-floor landing, the panel was an old brass box with embossed numbers and a Bakelite button polished by 1,000 thumbs. Luis jiggled the panel like a dentist examining a tooth. "These old systems get phantom currents," he said. "Crosstalk, feedback, who knows? My uncle had one in Sunset Park that would pick up taxi dispatch." As if to prove him right, the speaker hissed and popped, and the same thin voice dripped through the grill. "Please," it whispered. "Somebody, please." Mara pressed talk. "Eli, can you hear me? Where are you?" "Downstairs," came the answer, as if spoken through fabric. "Cold. Basement," Luis said softly. He touched the panel with the back of his fingers, as if checking for fever. Mara glanced at him, and he nodded toward the stairs. They went down together, leaving Mrs. Kovacs in her doorway like a nervous apparition, Theo hovering in his with the anxious energy of a man who would rather observe than act. The stairwell air grew colder with each step, as if the building's warmth were lying down to die. The basement door had a narrow wired glass window, opaque with condensation. Luis put his ear to it, then shrugged, unlocked it, and they slipped into a corridor painted a green that New York landlords favored when paint was cheap and optimism cheaper. The basement was a maze. Storage cages, a laundry room with machines that rumbled like contented beasts, a boiler room pulsing heat, a coal storage space long empty but still smelling of iron and dust. An empty vent shaft ran through the far wall, capped with a thick grate that sang faintly when trains tunneled past, a steel throat that swallowed the neighborhood's noise and exhaled it back as a low moan. In the storm, it sounded like the city itself was hurt. "Eli," Mara called, feeling ridiculous and also not. "Eli, you down here?" Her breath ghosted in the air. The wind howled in the shaft and the grate rattled. Pattern-seeking brain found words in the moan. "Please, please, please." The basement light flickered, steadied. Water dripped from a pipe in a steady, indifferent metronome. Luis swept the flashlight. It caught a smear on the concrete by the storage cages, thin and dark. He crouched. "Rust?" he asked, but his voice said he didn't believe it. He rubbed it with his finger, sniffed. "Iron. Could be old." Could be anything. I don't like it. Mara looked at the boiler, the sight glass bouncing with bubbles. She knew enough to be wary. In winter, Manhattan buildings made bargains with heat and air and carbon. Bad seals and blocked flues made ghosts without needing dead people. Let's check the chimney, she said. Snow like this can choke a draft. They went into the boiler room. The flue pipe was hot, the seams bright with fresh tape. Luis put a hand near the joint and felt for leaks. Feels okay, he said, which meant nothing. The intercom on the far wall, another old brass rectangle, crackled once and died. Then a cry tore through the basement, so close and sudden that Mora's bones went hot. Help me! They ran, slipping on wet concrete, hearts in their mouths. The sound came from the laundry room, or the storage, or the shaft. It came from everywhere and nowhere, thin and breathless and threaded with panic. When they reached the grate, the wind screamed through it like a living thing. Eli! Luis shouted into the steel throat. Hey! You're okay. Where are you? Downstairs, the voice sobbed. Down. The lights went out. The dark was full, not velvet or gentle but adhesive, a tar of shadow that negated space. The storm outside became the only geography, its sound raking the building from roof to cellar. Luis's flashlight swung up a second later, a cone of hard white that had never looked so holy. The beam found Mora's face, then the grate, then the floor where the smear was. The smear trailed, as if dragged by something small and stubborn, toward the locked cage of 00A. Whose cage is that? Mora asked, breath quick. Luis swallowed. Vacant. Belonged to a tenant who died last spring. Family never came for the junk. We were supposed to clean it out. Theo had followed them down after all, tentative as a deer, and now stood by the washing machines with his hands clenched under his armpits. Maybe a rat, he offered. Rats drag. Everything. Rats don't use intercoms, Mora said. They stood listening. The city roared in winter throat singing. Somewhere, on the other side of the emptier vent, steel screamed on steel. Then the intercom on the wall, dead just seconds ago, clicked alive, and a man's voice, flattened by distortion, said, rotating outage in effect. Please limit use of appliances. It repeated and repeated again, each time with minor variations, as if a tired person were trying to remember a script. PA system, Theo said. Coned. Or the MTA. Or, I don't know. Something official. Does Coned use our basement intercom? Luis asked. News to me. It's the storm scrambling everything, Theo said, with the certainty of a man that constants exist. Electricity is fluid. Mora's head throbbed. She realized she'd eaten nothing since an apple at 3 a.m. The flashlight flicked to the 00A cage. A small shape leaned in the corner, a child's snow boot, salt-stained and toppled on its side. The laces were stiff and turned into little bones by winter. Her stomach clenched because it was exactly the kind of thing that could be left behind, and exactly the kind of thing that wasn't. Bolt cutters, she said. Luis blew out a breath and nodded, vanished into the boiler room, came back with a red pair that had chipped handles. He snipped the cheap padlock like it was a weak decision. The cage door screamed when it opened. Inside, the smell was deeper than dust. Old cardboard, metal, and something colder, a scent like a freezer burned too long. Boxes sagged with age. A headless mannequin listed in one corner, draped in an army coat as if waiting to be told orders had changed. The boot had a damp, dark slush in its heel. Luis picked it up and tilted it. A small, flat key fell out, nicked with rust. Theo's eyes glittered. For what? He asked, hunger and fear wrapped around the same bone. They found the answer behind the mannequin, a metal panel flush with the wall. Old iron, painted over a dozen times, bolted at 4 corners. Louise put the key to a little round lock at its center, and it turned with a sticky finality that made everyone step back. "Is this a good idea?" Theo asked. "No," Mara said. "But neither is leaving a crying voice in a building." They pulled. The panel resisted, then gave, opening a black mouth that smelled of cold metal and forgotten things. A narrow service tunnel ran behind, barely shoulder-wide, framing pipes and cables and a trickle of condensed water. It sloped downward, toward the MTA shaft, toward a junction where city guts met building veins. Warm air breathed out, then sucked back like a sleeping lung. "Absolutely not," Theo whispered. The voice came again, thin and ragged. "Please." "Stay here," Louise said, and of course Mara said, "I'm coming," because that was how their grandmothers had raised them. She jammed the flashlight into her jacket pocket and took out her phone, whose battery icon already looked tired. No bars. Emergency calls only. She turned on the flashlight and ducked into the tunnel. The world narrowed to cold iron and wet stone. The scraped paint on the pipe rubbed off on her sleeve like chalk. Her breath fogged and hung. Every sound amplified. The creak of her boots, the suck of water, the rattling basso of the storm through the grate. She thought of all the times she'd moved toward trouble at the hospital because someone had to. The difference here was that nobody would chart it afterward. The tunnel bent left around a thick cable, then dropped one shallow step, then another. At the end stood another grate, smaller, older, over an opening that opened into darkness. Wind moved through it like a hand through hair. Below, barely visible, a landing, and on the landing, something pale. Mara crouched, the phone beam quivering in her hand. The pale thing was a hand itself, small, fingers splayed, skin the color of wet paper. She said, in a voice she recognized as her own from trauma bays and ambulance bays and bad nights, "Hey, buddy." The hand twitched. She slid through the round opening, shoulder scraping rust, ribs knitting with the grate's pattern. Luis was behind her, sweat bright on his temple despite the cold. Theo was somewhere back in the cage, arguing with gravity and fate. The landing was 2 feet wide, just concrete and damp and dust. Below it, a narrow spiral of steps made of metal treads that rang like coins when the wind struck them. The hand lay on the first step, attached to a small arm in a puffy jacket that was blue in the way cheap dye is blue. The body it belonged to was folded awkwardly, head down, a tangle of dark hair. "Eli," Mara said. The boy flinched. He turned his face toward the light. His lips were cracked. There were 2 white lines of salt on his cheeks where tears had dried. His eyes were the color of the river. "Cold," he whispered, as if the word were the only furniture left in his head. Mara squeezed his wrist, felt a pulse that was too thin, too fast. "We're here. Hey, Luis. He's here. He's real." It came out with a strange, naked relief that she hadn't been aware she needed. Luis's flashlight washed the steps. "Careful," he said. "That metal's slick." "Eli, can you stand?" Mara asked. He tried and made a sound like a cabinet door creaking. "No." "How did you get here?" She didn't ask why. Children go where openings allow. "Down," he said. He glanced past her toward the grate, toward the tunnel, toward the basement that led to a building that led to a city grinding under a storm. "Downstairs," he added, as if it were an answer to more than one question. Behind them, through layers of iron and brick, the intercom crackled again. It wasn't a voice this time, but a series of tones, as if a phone were dialing itself in an empty room. Theo's voice drifted thinly from the tunnel. "Hurry. My head hurts." He sounded woozy. "Luis," Mara said softly, "do you smell that?" He nodded. The warm, sweet reek that wasn't quite sweet. Exhaust without the noise. A garage after the door had stayed shut too long. Carbon monoxide didn't have a smell, not really, but bad drafts brought friends. Oil, hot dust, the old breath of burned things. "Gotta move," Luis said. "Storm probably packed the roof vents. We're swimming in build-up." Mara put the boy's arm over her shoulders. "Up we go, Eli." One step, and then another. They climbed. The spiral rang. Eli's boots slipped. His left foot dragged. The air felt thinner than honesty. Luis steadied her twice when she rocked. At the tunnel's mouth, Theo's face appeared, pale and damp, eyes glassy. "I can't. My fingers feel fuzzy." "Get upstairs," Mara said. "Now." Windows open. All of them. Theo blinked, then shambled away like something with its batteries failing. They guided Eli through the cage, past the mannequin's headless patients, across the concrete where the smear had dried and been remade by the damp, into the laundry room where machines sat unplugged and huge. The intercom on the wall spat a sentence that rearranged its words in transit. "Limit use. Outage rotating. Appliances, please." Like an anxious stutter. The building vibrated with train and wind and all the other things the city is made of when it thinks no one is watching. On the second floor, Mrs. Kovacs's door was open wide. Her face was a relief map of fear. "I made tea," she said, as if ritual could fix physics. "Sit, sit. I will get blankets." Mara pushed Eli onto her own couch instead, propped pillows behind his back, checked capillary refill, watched his breath. She opened windows exactly 2 inches, enough to coax movement, not enough to invite the storm. Theo returned with a stack of towels and a paper bag of batteries. He looked better when the air changed, as if a fog had slipped off his brain and gone to look for somebody else. Luis ran back downstairs to the boiler room to kill the burner and prop the flue with an iron bar. When he returned, he had a black smear on his cheek and a story about a drift piled against the roof vents like a white seal. He called 911. He used a voice that made dispatchers dispatch faster. While they waited for EMS, the building made its noises. The radiator knocked once, softer than before. A gust rattled the kitchen window and flung a little spray through the screen so it freckled the sink. The intercom at the door clicked, and clicked again. Theo flinched. Mara stood and pressed talk. "We're okay. We found him." Static. For a moment, the thin child's voice appeared again, a threadbare ghost. "Thank you," it said, and then bled into someone else entirely. A man. "All residents monitor for symptoms. Evacuate if." The paramedics arrived in boots that did not trip over this building's memory. They put a pulse oximeter on Eli's finger and said, "Yeah," in a way that meant not good. They put oxygen on his face. One of them, a woman with a Queen's accent and a comm too durable to be purchased, turned to Mara and said, "You look grey. You need a ride." "No," Mara said. "Just air." She didn't bother to add that she was a nurse. They could smell each other a mile off, even through storm and fear. Eli's mother arrived soon after. Thin parka, panic eyes, face like a dish that had survived 2 cracks and a glue job. "He left a note to go downstairs," she said, breathless and raw. "I thought he meant the laundry." He heard it on the intercom, he said. "A boy. Calling." "Phones can pick up things," Theo said to nobody and everybody. "Wires cross. Radios bounce. Signals get trapped in structures. There's a study of." He stopped. He was trying to be rational hard enough to sweat. The EMTs took Eli down the stairs. The building breathed. The storm began to fold in on itself, as if tired. Luis went to shovel the roof. Theo made tea that tasted like boiled hope. Mrs. Kovacs sat in Mora's living room and stared at the intercom as if it were an altar. When they were alone, Mora went back to the basement. She didn't know why. Perhaps to close the cage. Perhaps to reassure herself that the tunnel was just a tunnel. She took Luis's flashlight and walked through air that felt cleaner now but still carried the wreckage of the night. The 00A cage hung open like a mouth. She closed it and looped a new lock through, one of those cheap brass numbers from the bodega. Something glinted in the dust by the grate. A coin. She crouched and picked it up. A subway token. Not one of the commemorative ones, but the old pre-MetroCard kind, with a Y punched out. It had been out of circulation for decades. She turned it over. It was slick with damp, cold enough to bite. It could have been in any New York basement, dropped by any hand. It could have fallen from a box of junk. It could have been a rat treasure. On the wall above the token, someone had once scratched letters into the paint. She hadn't noticed before. Maybe she hadn't been meant to. Lie, it said, shallow and crooked. The letters were old. The paint around them faded in a halo where someone had tried, poorly, to sand them out. A train passed on the other side of the vent and plucked the grate like a harp. The sound it made was soft, almost kind. For an instant she thought she heard a child laugh, but it was just wind and steel, just patterns, just a city that had learned to sing with its scars. When she came back upstairs, Luis had snow in his hair. Theo had found statistics about CO exposure on his phone and was reading them out loud to Mrs. Kovacs, who nodded as if numbers could be prayers. The intercom crackled again, and a crisp voice said, "Power restored." The lights brightened. The radiator hissed like a cat, deciding you were acceptable. Mora stood with her hand on the kitchen counter, feeling the building hum through her bones. On the window glass, condensation had drifted into trails. They coalesced into lines and then into letters that held for a breath and then slid. For that breath, she could swear she saw "thank you." Theo saw nothing. Mrs. Kovacs said, as if remembering a recipe. Luis said he needed a new shovel. The roof one had snapped like a pretzel. That night, when they finally slept, with windows open a whisper, with alarms on their phones set to wake them every hour, they dreamed of trains and snow and the metallic smell of winter. And in the morning, on the stoop, where the plows had made small mountains on either side like gatekeepers of the block, there were small footprints where no child had any business being. Up the center steps, to the vestibule door, then away again, vanishing into the slap-slung gray at the curb. The plows could have dragged a boot. The wind could have made shapes. A neighbor kid could have played while his mother yelled to get inside. All of it could be true. That was the arrangement New York offered. Everything can be explained, and sometimes the explanation doesn't make anything smaller. Mora kept the token in her coat pocket, where it warmed to her. Now and then, days later, she would feel it and imagine a station without a map, a platform without an address, a voice on the old brass intercom asking politely for something everyone needs. She would touch the coin as she stepped onto a modern train with no slots, just glass, and hear, impossible ordinary, the faintest kind of thank you rise from the tracks and vanish into the city's draft.